Hello, I'm Kate Bullard Adams, and I'm grateful to Joe Mouskoff for giving me another opportunity to read. This time, I'll be sharing a story called The Longitude Problem. It was inspired by two trips some years ago, one to Costa Rica and the other to the Royal Observatory at Greenwich in England. It was there that I was introduced to the longitude problem. I have to admit I never heard of it, and I'm not usually drawn to scientific subject matter. But the Royal Observatory is a beautiful building designed by Sir Christopher Wren, set up on a knoll overlooking the Thames, a beautiful site. And it was built in 1676 specifically for the purpose of solving the longitude problem. The exhibits there are truly fascinating. I'll give a very brief explanation of the longitude problem in this story, but for anyone who'd like to know more, I highly recommend a book by Davis Sobel called Longitude, the true story of a lone genius who solved the greatest scientific problem of his time. This was a bestseller back in the 1990s, and it really is a kind of page-turner. I'd like to dedicate this story to my husband, Bo Sutterth, who introduced me to the Royal Observatory and the longitude problem. Once again, Alice's eyes rounded the bases from her wristwatch to the wall clock to the sun-soaked entrance to the hotel. 9:10, still no sign of the driver. She took a deep breath. She reminded herself she was in Costa Rica. Life here moved at a slower pace. This was a vacation. She was supposed to relax. She didn't need to remind herself she was a single woman who spoke no Spanish, and for reasons she had a hard time remembering, she had brought her 13-year-old son and 10-year-old daughter to a third-world country for their first spring break since their parents' divorce. Wearing a pair of Tories soccer shorts, Sam, whose duffel bag had disappeared between South Carolina and San Jose, smiled into the musical oblivion of his Walkman. Tori flipped through the Mad magazine she'd bought during the delay in Miami that had made it midnight by the time they arrived at the hotel the night before. "Look," she had whispered, her sleep-starved eyes widened by the gun that gleamed from the concierge's belt. Alice had feigned nonchalance, but after they checked into the room and the children collapsed into bed, she had shoved the coffee table and a floor lamp in front of the bolted door. And then she'd sunk into a fitful half-sleep, her Swiss Army knife clutched in her hand, drifting in and out of nightmares that featured sombreroed bandoleros taking target practice at a dummy dressed in Sam's lost clothing. With a final glance at the empty entrance, Alice walked over to the concierge and held up a travel voucher. A shuttle was supposed to be here at 9 to take us to Arenal. Do you think we missed it? The concierge shook his head. "Not to worry, Senora. It's here soon, 5-10 minutes." Alice went back to her chair, gave the kids a little wave. "Any second now." They nodded with implacable calm. After an interminable 10 minutes, Alice went back to the concierge. This time he took the voucher and picked up the phone. A brief conversation followed. "Salado, Senora," he began as he hung up. "I have bad news." Alice's stomach erupted with a spurt of anxiety, the response that had become a reflex in recent years. The shuttle had indeed forgotten them and was now too far out of town to turn around. But the concierge raised his index finger like a flag. "A taxi will come take you to Arenal. In 5 minutes, I will tell Luis." He nodded toward the doorman, who smiled grimly from the trap of his too-tight uniform. Alice eked out a thank you, then turned and walked unsteadily across the slick wooden floor that seemed to shift like a ship beneath her. Within the hour, they were on their way with a driver who spoke no English in a cab that had no air conditioning. Sam and Tori swooned in the back seat, while Alice aimed her face out the rolled-down window, away from the pina colada-scented air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror, and the driver whose name she didn't know. They started off on a highway, then segued onto a barely paved road that twisted past sugarcane fields and muddy streams. Alice searched in vain for the exotic birds and three-toed sloths that, according to the travel agent, were everywhere. She had read that the drive to Arenal took about 3 hours, but she saw few signs and none that she could decipher. As they continued on, she realized that whenever they reached a crossroads, the driver yelled something out the window to bystanders, who answered with shrugged shoulders or volleys of words accompanied by fingers pointing in various dusty directions. In the course of these exchanges, Alice began to recognize one word, Arenal. And finally, when the driver braked for yet another roadside consultation, her growing unease erupted into informed hysteria. "Do you know where we're going?" she blurted, the fear in her voice a universal language. The driver looked at her with wary incomprehension. "No entiendo." "Arenal," Alice said, her shaking fingers stumbling through the Lonely Planet guidebook. She found a 2-page blow-up of northwestern Costa Rica. "Here," she leaned toward the driver, pointed frantically at the map. "Arenal." He gave it a quick glance. "Si, Arenal," then looked resolutely ahead and resumed driving. Alice retreated into her corner of the cab, scouring the landscape for anything that might tell her where they were. The countryside had become hillier and browner, and a mountain range rose beyond distant fields. But she had no frame of reference for the changing scenery, no context for these geographical clues. The longitude problem, Charles would have said, using the catchphrase he'd given Alice's knack for getting lost. Charles was a passionate sailor. At least he was passionate about something besides heart surgery, she thought when she was trying to put a positive spin on things, and had an internal compass of unerring accuracy. He put this to good use when they traveled, and Alice had enjoyed the luxury of following along, of not having to worry about directions or distance. Even toward the end of their marriage, when he did little more than show up for dinner, he still planned the family vacations. And years ago, in the early days of their courtship, when Alice was still trying to learn how to navigate on her own, he told her the story of the longitude problem. To know where you are at sea, or anywhere for that matter, you need to know your latitude and longitude. Latitude, the north-south coordinate, is easy. The ancient Greeks figured it out by measuring the movement of the sun and the pole star relative to the equator. Longitude, however, was trickier. There was no fixed point, no east-west equivalent of the equator to work from. As long as you were on land or in sight of physical landmarks, the problem was manageable. But at sea, it could and often did mean disaster, especially during the age of exploration. For the countries whose ships made it home, the rewards were great enough to get the attention of those in power. In 1714, under Charles II, the British Parliament passed the Longitude Act, promising a huge reward to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. Many would-be winners looked to the stars, sure that the answer lay there as it had for latitude. Even more numerous were those who looked to superstition, folklore, and the occult. Their best efforts proved futile, however, and discovering the longitude became a synonym both for the pursuit of the impossible and for quackery of all kinds. Only when time was recognized as the key to the problem did real progress begin. If there were a way of carrying reliable home port time aboard ship, then the difference between that and the time wherever the ship was, which could be calculated using the sun or stars, would establish the longitude. And when, after years of painstaking experimentation, a little-known clockmaker named John Harrison created a timepiece that remained accurate despite the vicissitudes of an ocean voyage, the longitude problem was finally solved. Stuck with sweat to the cab's vinyl seat, Alice looked at her watch, the one she'd gotten for $4.95 and 3 Cheerios UPC codes. Its face was bright yellow with black numbers, and despite the taxi's trembling list, the tiny Cheerio that served as a second hand continued its steady circumnavigation. Noon, the watch said. She knew it was an hour earlier at home. Was that all the information she needed to figure out her longitude? "Where are we, Mom?" From the back seat, Tori's voice had the groggy plaint of a foghorn. Alice looked out the window at the alien swell of parched grass. "We're at sea, darling," she answered. "We're simply at sea." After stopping for lunch at a sagging shack where flies hovered over the counter and chickens, perhaps related to the polo that came with the beans and rice the driver ordered for them, wandered the floor, they continued on. Finally, Alice saw a sign, Arenal, 80 kilometers. "Look," she lurched forward in her seat. "Arenal! Sam, how far is 80 kilometers?" "Oh," Sam strummed the rubber band on his braces, "about 50 miles." Alice turned back toward the dashboard, looked at the speedometer. It was hovering around 60. Kilometers, she presumed, and as she tried to convert that for herself, her eyes landed on the gas gauge. The needle pointed to the extreme left, pinned on E. Empty. Alice squinted, willed it to waver. It didn't budge. For another long moment, she stared. Then with a shudder, an inner roil that brought a rancid surge of polo into her mouth, she sank back in the seat. Sure in the conviction that there was nothing more she wanted to see, she closed her eyes. 20 minutes later, Alice awoke, startled like a sleeping dog by an involuntary twitch in her legs. She jerked to attention. How could she have let down her guard? A quick glance at the back seat reassured her of Sam and Tori's safety. The driver appeared as oblivious to her presence as ever. As she wiped the drool from her mouth, words of recrimination from handbook to navigation came back to her. Stern warnings about the watch's responsibility for keeping the vessel on course, for dealing with any threatening developments. What signs might she have missed? Could the driver even read? Her fears were soon assuaged by a sign, this one larger than the first and with more precise information. Arenal Observatory Lodge, it said, 50 kilometers. Kids, there's a sign for our hotel. Sam gave her a thumbs up. Tori smiled, her eyes moored to Mad. From her satchel, Alice pulled out the big zippered wallet full of vouchers that the travel agent had given her. The red one for the Arenal Lodge was on top. She resumed her watch, which quickly became focused on signage rather than scenery. It came as a surprise then when the driver pointed to the left and announced, Arenal. Leaning forward, Alice spotted the majestic plumed cone. Sam, Tori. They were already turned toward the window. Is that smoke? Tori asked. Alice nodded, ogling the billow of white. Awesome, said Sam, his head bobbing to the beat of his Walkman. Within minutes, they came to a large sign with an arrow that pointed down a dirt road. Arenal Observatory Lodge. The driver looked at Alice. She gave him a firm nod. They made the turn. The road proved to be barely passable, with huge ruts that swallowed the cab's tires. Like a trampoline, it tossed them up and down and enveloped them in dust that melted into a muddy film on Alice's arms. The only thing that withstood the pounding was the gas gauge, which never moved. After an interminable half hour, they came to a gate with the guardhouse. The attendant, reassuringly official-looking in an almost crisp khaki shirt and shorts, stepped out. He spoke briefly to the driver, then leaned down. You have a reservation? He asked Alice. Yes, she answered, her mouth dry and her tongue thick with dust. Carol, Alice Carroll, and my 2 children. Gracias, he said, then went back to the guardhouse. After a few minutes, he returned with a clipboard. I am sorry, he began, but we have no reservation for you. But here's the voucher right here. Alice handed it to the guard. He took a quick glance. I am sorry, Senora, he said, and this time Alice's stomach erupted with a violence that surely equaled anything the volcano could offer. This is not the Arenal Lodge. This is the Arenal Observatory Lodge. The what? Alice stared blankly at the guard. The Arenal Observatory Lodge, he repeated, and went on to explain that the Arenal Lodge was an entirely different establishment about 20 kilometers away. Alice hardly heard him. All she could think about was having to turn around and drive back down the gauntlet of the entrance road. For a few moments, she couldn't move. Then she forced her hand to take the voucher, now soggy with sweat, from the guard. "Would you please tell him," she nodded toward the driver, "how to get there?" With a courteous dip of his head, the guard began talking to the driver in rapid-fire Spanish. Alice turned to Sam and Tori. "I am so sorry," she began, fighting the wobble in her voice. "It's okay," Tori said with a wavery smile, her Mad magazine spread-eagled across her stomach. "Yes," Sam said firmly. "No rush." He swapped his Walkman for a hearty boy's book. Alice reached back, squeezed the damp knobs of their knees. Then, with a final glance at the gap-toothed taunt of Alfred E. Newman's "What? Me worry?" grin, she turned around in her seat and gave up the useless effort of trying not to cry. By the time they reached the lodge, where the receptionist bore no firearms and fellow guests spoke English, all Alice wanted to do was stay there. But she told the children earlier about the thermal pools at nearby Tabacon Springs, and Sam said they'd regret it the rest of their lives if they didn't go. 2 hours later, the shuttle delivered them to the Tabacon entrance, a dirt drop-off next to a rough-hewn palisade fence. Alice confirmed a pickup time with the driver, then led the children to the ticket counter. A hand-painted sign listed special rates for families and other groups, but Alice wasn't sure what she and the children qualified for. When she reached the cashier, she simply raised 3 fingers and handed over what seemed an exorbitant number of colones for what she was sure would be a second-rate water park. She was wrong. The pools were surrounded by luxurious tropical gardens, illuminated for the evening and linked by a stream that led gracefully from one steam-shrouded spring to the next. In the suits they'd worn under their clothes, Alice, Sam, and Tori joined the other bathers in floating past ferny grottos, around rocky outcroppings, and over shallow falls. And in the midst of this idyll, they all gasped as one when Arenal rumbled and growled and spat flames into the sky. They ate dinner at the open-air restaurant by the largest of the pools. The hostess seated them toward the side, in a no-man's land between the large, noisy family groups and the romantic tables for two. Even though she'd been divorced for less than a year, Alice was well acquainted with the awkward world she had entered, a universe that, especially in a place as conservative as Charleston, wasn't quite sure how to handle the odd woman out. There were certain of her married friends she hadn't heard from in months. Dinner party invitations had disappeared. And when she was with the children, almost everything became a reminder of the missing corner of their quadrangle, the empty chair at dinner, the gap in the row of Christmas stockings, the void that left them lopsided and uneven, a table with a broken leg. Their nearest neighbors were 2 men, about her age, she guessed, who appeared to be a couple. "Where are you from?" one of them asked with a relaxed smile and a Midwestern accent. After a day of captivity in the cab, Alice welcomed his overture. The men, Lewis and Clark, "It was meant to be," said Lewis with a wink, were from Minnesota and on their 3rd trip to Costa Rica. Their routine was simple. They rented a Jeep and wandered, and they raved about the friendliness of the people, the unspoiled beauty, the endless variety of things to see and do. They were distressed to hear of Alice's misadventures. "We always overpack," Clark said. "Why don't we give your son some of our clothes?" Although Sam's whole body would have fit into one of the men's pants legs, and their floral shirts weren't exactly his style, Alice was touched. She thanked them profusely, even as she demurred. And it was with real regret that she said goodbye when they got up to leave. "They were nice, weren't they?" Sam said, swabbing his ketchup-smeared plate with a French fry as the men walked away. Yes, they were. Alice smiled at their receding backs, felt her throat tighten as Lewis put his hand on Clark's shoulder. They were very nice. The next day, Alice and the children went on a tour of the wildlife refuge at Cano Negro. Most of what they saw, egrets, herons, cormorants, were familiar sights from Charleston. But any disappointment Alice might have felt was overridden by her relief at freedom from calamity. Back at the lodge, Alice reviewed the next day's schedule. The itinerary, which she knew by heart, called for a land transfer in the morning to San Jose Pavas Airport, where they'd catch an early morning flight to Puerto Jimenez. But it was only when she looked at the voucher that she realized the transfer was scheduled for 4 a.m. Alice stared in disbelief. How had she let this happen? But of course, her inner voice of reason, which sounded uncomfortably like Charles, chided her. If it took 3 hours to get from San Jose to Arenal, it would take 3 hours to get back. Therefore, anyone staying at Arenal and booked on an 8:30 a.m. flight out of San Jose would have to wake up in the middle of the night to get there. Voucher in hand, she went to the front desk. "Si, senora," the receptionist said, consulting her notebook. "Jorge will pick you up in the parking lot at 4. Very early, eh?" And it was indeed very early and very dark when at 3:45 Alice, Sam, and Tori dragged their duffel bags out to the parking lot. At 4:10, just as Alice was about to give up, headlights appeared. She and the children froze in their glare. "Senora Carroll?" a deep voice asked from the vehicle. Alice squinted into the blinding beams. "Si, yes." A large man in a wife-beater T-shirt stepped out. "Jorge?" Alice asked. She hoped he would say no. "Si." "And you're taking us to San Jose Pavas Airport?" "Si." He began loading their bags. Alice took a seat in the middle row of the van, which at least was a new vehicle with seat belts. Sam and Tori settled in the way back and within minutes fell asleep. Alice, however, was relentlessly awake, her vigilance heightened by the freezing blast of the air conditioner, whose temperature apparently suited the T-shirted Jorge. As if strapped in a spaceship, she stared at the darkness that swallowed them whole, the emptiness that engulfed them like the belly of a beast. She could tell, though, as her ears began to pop, that they were rising to a higher altitude, and as her eyes adjusted, she saw that they were in the mountains, in terrain unlike anything they had driven through in the taxi. Once again, as if in a recurring nightmare, she had no idea where she was and had no way of finding out. Maybe Jorge was kidnapping them. They might already be in Nicaragua. She remembered that much from the map. Alice closed her eyes, tried to calm herself. Hadn't Lewis and Clark told her how friendly Costa Ricans were? Hadn't they assured her that she and the children were absolutely safe? She opened her eyes, looked at the monolith of Jorge's head. It was no use. All she could do was grope in her bag for a Swiss Army knife, then hold it as tightly as she could in her cold, clammy hands. As it turned out, they got to the airport without incident and even had time to eat breakfast before boarding their plane, a tiny 12-seater. Alice wasn't scared of flying, but she'd suffered since childhood from motion sickness. In the old days, she would have drugged herself with Dramamine and let Charles take charge. But now she couldn't risk any impairment of her faculties. So she was experimenting for the first time with an aeroband, a wristband advertised as the natural treatment for nausea. Seated next to Tori, right behind the pilot who had no cockpit to hide in, Alice got the aeroband out of her bag. The trick, according to the directions, was to wear the band so that a small metal bead pressed against the P6 acupressure point. P6 was located 3 finger widths up from the wrist line, in the middle of the tendons between 2 bones. As Alice raised her fingers to her wrist, she thought once again of Charles's long-ago account of the longitude problem and the harebrained solutions that it inspired. The best one involved the powder of sympathy, a remarkable concoction that, if applied to a bandage or other item associated with the patient's injury, could supposedly heal and trigger the pain of healing, even if the patient were miles away. To solve the longitude problem, then, the powder's advocates suggested that a wounded dog be carried aboard ship. Back on shore, a bandage from the dog's wound could be dipped in the powder of sympathy every day at noon, causing the dog to yelp and thereby informing the captain and crew of the time at the home port. With a smile, Alice followed the instructions for the arrow band. As you press against the tendons, a slight soreness will let you know that you have found P6. "What are you doing, Mom?" asked Tori, her face filled for the first time on the trip with real alarm. Alice strapped on the wristband, gave Tori a hug. "Just solving the longitude problem, darling," she said. "That's all." As it turned out, Alice spent most of the flight relieving herself of breakfast as the plane rose and fell, banked and bucked. By the time it began its descent, she had sunk into a stupor. But she was jarred to consciousness by the pilot, who rolled down his window and began to yell. What on earth? Alice looked out her own window and saw children scattering in all directions across a strip of asphalt that looked no wider or longer than a driveway. "Oh, my God," she murmured as the plane proceeded to land, fishtailing across what she realized was the runway. Aghast, she looked at Tori, who closed the copy of the 5 Little Peppers that Alice had given her for Easter. "Looks like we made it, Mom," she said. Alice squeezed the child's hand. On shaky legs, she stood up, gathered their belongings, and stepped off the plane. They spent the next hour waiting in a clearing for the shuttle to their next stop, a wilderness resort called Lapa Rios. The 2 available benches were already occupied, so they settled on their duffel bags under a tree. "May I offer you my seat?" An older man with a British accent tipped his hat toward Alice as he rose from the end of a bench. "Oh, thank you. We're fine," Alice said with false bravado. Her stomach was still in distress, and her skin felt like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. "Mom, can we get a drink?" Sam pointed to a woman under an umbrella who was selling soft drinks from a styrofoam cooler. Alice pulled some crumpled colones from her pocket. "And please get me something like a ginger ale or 7-Up. The woman seated next to the man who'd offered his seat gave her a sympathetic smile. "On holiday?" she asked. Alice laughed. Holiday was even more of a misnomer than vacation for whatever it was they were on. "We're trying," she began, then realized she couldn't trust her voice to continue. The woman came to her rescue. "Oh, I remember when our children were about the ages of yours. Charles was on assignment in Spain," she said, then continued to recount the disastrous trip she and her children had made to join him. While she talked, her husband gazed benignly into space, legs crossed, his sandal-clad foot wagging like a tail. "When we finally got there," she concluded, "I simply handed the children over to him and said, 'Here, they're yours,' and got myself a separate room for the evening." She looked at Charles with a triumphant smile. Charles continued to gaze affably into space. "Yes," he said, "Alice has never let me forget that most unfortunate incident." Through the fog of heat and nausea, the name registered. Alice. And his name was Charles. From her solitary seat on the duffel bag, Alice squinted at the couple, the unwitting doppelgangers who now looked at her with expectant eyes, waiting, she thought, for her to recount her story in exchange for theirs. All she could do was force a smile. "Well, you both lived to tell the tale," she said, grateful for the return that moment of Sam and Tori and for the drink they dropped in her lap. And with a hand that felt like a phantom limb, she opened the frosty green can and took a sip. The drive to Lapa Rios was a bone breaker. Seated on benches in the back of a pickup truck, they jolted past miles of farmland over roads as bad as those to Arenal. Finally, they entered a forest, and the road began to rise, offering occasional glimpses of the ocean and the blessed coolness of a breeze. Finally, they reached the resort. Nature, but just the good parts, is the way the travel agent had described Lapa Rios. As soon as they got out of the truck, a toucan glided past, and hummingbirds hovered around the entrance to the lodge. The path to their cottage wound through dense vegetation with not a shriveled flower or a dead leaf in sight. And waiting for them in their thatch-roofed bungalow was a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of fresh pineapple. Despite the exotic activities Lapa Rios offered, Alice could handle nothing more strenuous than lounging around the pool that afternoon, and the children were tired enough to do the same. By 10 the next morning, though, they were at the activities hut, doused with bug spray, ready to set out on the natural healing hike. Alice wasn't especially interested in healing, natural or otherwise. Since the divorce, she'd had an aversion to anything related to doctors or medicine. But she wanted to go on a hike, and this was the only one that didn't mean waking up too early for the kids. The fact that a shaman would be their guide suggested that it would be safely unscientific. Santiago the shaman looked the part, old and wizened with feathers stuck in his long gray ponytail, and hands that didn't look like they'd ever seen an antibacterial scrub. He greeted Alice and the children, then explained in broken English that they would wait to see if anyone else showed up. To pass the time, he opened the pouch that hung around his neck and showed them its contents: leaves, roots, twigs, something that looked like a dried monkey's paw. Alice could hardly understand anything he said, but that suited her fine. She was happy to steer clear of the field that had turned Charles into someone who wasn't interested in anyone he couldn't operate on. Just as Santiago was returning his treasures to their pouch, a young couple walked up. "We're here for the... Hey!" With a startled double-take, the man took off his sunglasses and stared from Sam to Tori. "Aren't you Dr. Carroll's kids?" Sam nodded. "We're on spring break," he offered, "with our mom." Alice stepped forward. "I'm Alice?" The man blinked. "I'm Ward Smith, one of Dr. Carroll's residents." His face reddened. "And this is my wife, Sandra. We're on our honeymoon." "Congratulations," Alice smiled with what she hoped was a neutral expression, one that conveyed neither her guilty sense of being a bad omen, a harbinger of doom for their newly minted marriage, nor her sadness at this reminder of her own early years of marital innocence, nor her mounting amazement, not to mention annoyance, at this looking-glass world that was making Charles part of a trip whose whole point was to leave him behind. I might as well have bought him a ticket, Alice thought. Or maybe, she ruminated, there was meant to be an end-of-marriage equivalent to the beginning-of-marriage honeymoon. Maybe there was supposed to be one final disastrous expedition that brought the conjugal journey to an inarguable end. If so, she knew she was on it. Santiago led the five of them into the rainforest, a green-roofed wilderness thick with vines and vegetation, and air that hardly moved under its moisture-laden weight. The newlyweds fell in line behind the shaman, while Sam and Tori ambled after. Alice brought up the rear. Occasionally, Santiago stopped to point out a particular plant and discuss its medicinal properties. Ward asked a few questions, appearing to understand Santiago and to be genuinely engaged. Maybe he thinks he can learn something, Alice thought. Maybe he still believes in healing that doesn't involve a scalpel. Sandra, on the other hand, seemed mostly to be going along for the ride, smiling blandly as she wiped the sweat from her face with the bandana. Alice took this as a bad sign. If Sandra didn't like medicine now, just wait. Just wait until Ward lost himself in the hermetic world of the hospital and gave himself up to the magic and the mystery of the operating room, where he could put someone to sleep and cut open her chest and handle her heart, actually hold it in his hands, without ever having to acknowledge that it was anything more than a pump. The longer they had been married, the more Alice had felt that Charles resented the fact that he couldn't do the same to her. But Alice didn't like to be cynical. Maybe Ward and Sandra would be two of the lucky ones. Alice knew surgeons who seemed to hang on to their lives, who could go to the hospital, plunge into the punishing terrain of their profession, and still find their way home. Maybe they'd invented a special kind of compass. Maybe they concocted a modern-day powder of sympathy. Whatever their secret, Alice hoped Ward and Sandra would discover it. And she only wished that she and Charles had stumbled upon it during that nightmare of years when they were lost in the wilderness that their marriage had become. She only wished they had found it before they both realized, first Alice, then Charles, that it was too late. That evening, Alice and the children strolled up to the main pavilion for dinner. Just outside the dining room, they found a group with binoculars scanning the sky. An aspiring bird watcher, Alice stopped. "What's out there?" she asked. "Parrots," a woman answered. "They're flying home for the night. Want to see?" She offered Alice her binoculars that looked like they knew a lot more about bird watching than Alice did. Alice accepted. "So where are they?" "Over there." The woman pointed toward the far ridge. "That's where they spend the day, then they fly back to the other ridge for the night. See, there's a couple right now." Spotting the two small specks, Alice raised the binoculars. To her amazement, they landed on the birds, who were far enough away that she could follow their flight. Quickly, she adjusted the focus. "They're gorgeous," she said, thrilled by the flash of their wings. "Aren't they?" the woman said. "And they're always in pairs. They mate for life." Alice's hand stalled. The birds disappeared. She handed the binoculars back to the woman. "Thanks, that was a real treat." "You're quite welcome," the woman said, her eyes already hidden behind the binoculars. Alice and the children continued on to the dining room. There were the usual couples, Sandra and Ward nestled in a candlelit corner on the far side of the room, and the usual family foursomes, and they all looked cheerful and content, secure in a world of even-numbered equanimity. The host, one of the local Costa Ricans who comprised the staff, welcomed them with a bow. "Your name, please?" he asked with a strong accent. "Carol, Alice Carroll, and my 2 children." "And you are a family?" The question lingered as he gazed expectantly past Alice. She hesitated, then realized he was looking for the missing 4th member. "Yes," she put her arms firmly around Sam and Tori. "We are a family." The man, whose name tag said Emilio, blushed. "Please to come with me," he turned and led them across the room to a small table that was tucked right up against the railing of the open-air pavilion. It offered exactly 3 seats, one on each side and one at the end, and spectacular views of the Gulf and the ocean. "Signora," Emilio said, pulling out the chair at the end. "Gracias," said Alice as she sat down with the children on either side. "Your waiter will come soon. Please to enjoy your dinner," Emilio said. With a final bow, he left. Smiling at the children, who were already busy with the basket of homemade bread, Alice looked out at the water that glistened in the sun's last long rays. A small boat made its way toward shore, its sail hardly more than a handkerchief in the distance. A fishing boat, maybe. Or maybe, Alice thought, the boat she and the children would take to go snorkeling the next day. For a moment, she followed its steady progress. Then she closed her eyes, breathed in the breeze that bathed her cheek. "Like a roll, Mom?" Alice blinked at Tori's offering. "I'd love one," she said. And with a hand that didn't hesitate, she reached for the roll and took her first bite. Thank you very much for listening.